A 4,000-year-old tablet from Nippur describes the inside of the earth making a sound. Not thunder, not earthquakes. A tone. Steady, low, always there. The way a struck bell keeps ringing long after you stop touching it. The Sumerians called it the voice under the mountain, and the strangest part is how calm they are about it. They treat it as ordinary, something every generation could hear if they were taught how to listen. But the tablet ends on a warning. The voice can go quiet. And when it goes quiet, the text says, it is not because the thing below has left, it is because it noticed you. Nippur. Around 2100 BCE, a flat brown city on a flat brown plain, baking under a sky that hadn't changed in 1,000 years. There were no mountains anywhere near it. You could walk for days in any direction and never see ground rise higher than a temple wall. And yet the most important building in the city was named the Mountain House. They called it the Aquifer. The temple of Enlil, the god the Sumerians believed had split the sky from the earth and held the two apart. The Aquifer was where heaven and the ground beneath it were said to touch. Where decisions about the world were handed down, travelers came from every city in the south to stand at its base, and the name never made sense to anyone studying it later, because there was no mountain. The land was as flat as a table. Unless the mountain they meant was the one underneath. The tablet sits today in a museum collection, filed under the label CBS 14061. It came out of the ground at Nippur, baked clay, both faces covered edge to edge in the wedge marks of cuneiform. For a long time, nobody paid it much attention. It read like a temple record, routine, the kind of record-keeping clay that survives by the tens of thousands, listing grain and silver and the names of officers nobody remembers. Then a translator working through the back of the tablet stopped. The text was not listing grain, it was logging a sound. The description is patient and oddly exact. It speaks of a low tone that rose from below the temple floor, felt more than heard, a pressure that sat in the chest of anyone who stood still long enough in the deepest room. The scribe does not call it a god speaking. He does not call it thunder or the groan of the ground before a quake. He calls it a steady thing, an always thing, a sound that had been beneath the city since before the city and would be beneath it after. You would have felt it before you understood it, low in the body. The kind of sound that isn't really a sound, more a thing the room does to you. And the priests at Nippur, according to the tablet, had spent generations learning to listen to it on purpose. This is the part everyone misses. The tablet describes a method, not prayer, a set of steps. The listeners would lie flat against the stone of the lowest floor, in the dark, in silence, and wait until the body settled enough to feel the tone come up through the rock. They used water as well. Shallow bowls set on the floor, the surface watched by lamplight for the faint shaking that meant the voice was strong that night. They had words for its moods. Nights it was thin. Nights it pressed hard enough to bother them. Nights it seemed to come from one side of the room more than the other. They wrote it all down, the way star watchers a few cities over were writing down the movements of the planets. Same patience, same endless care. Except these men were not looking up. They were listening down. Think about that for a second. A steady low signal, coming from deep inside the planet, recorded by people who had no tools that could measure a sound like that. No idea of sound waves, no science of sound at all. And they treated it not as a miracle but as a fact of the world, something that was simply there, like the river, like the heat. For most of the last century, experts who read lines like this filed them under poetry. The breathing of the world, the voice in the deep, beautiful language, they assumed, for the rumble of distant earthquakes, or wind moving through a buried cistern, or nothing at all, a figure of speech dressed up as fact. That idea held until the late 1990s, when earthquake scientists confirmed something that should not be possible to confirm. The earth hums, not after earthquakes, all the time. A faint, endless trembling of the entire planet, present in the ground even when nothing is shaking, when no quake has struck for days. Scientists had guessed at it as far back as 1959. The Great Chilean Earthquake of 1960, the largest ever recorded, rang the planet like a bell and let researchers measure the way the whole Earth bends and rings, but they assumed that ringing always faded. That without a quake to start it, the planet fell silent. In 1998, a team of Japanese scientists proved it never does. Working through years of data from very sensitive tools, Naoki Suda and his team found a shaking that was always present, with no earthquake to cause it. A background tone, low and steady, that the planet makes on its own, without pause. They measured its pitch. The strongest part of the signal sits between roughly 2.9 and 4.5 millihertz. Sit with that number for a moment, because it is the part that should not exist. 2.9 millihertz is far, far below anything a human ear can pick up. Human hearing stops at around 20 hertz. The Earth's hum is something like 10,000 times lower than that. It is not a sound you can hear. It is barely a sound at all in any normal sense. It is the whole body of the planet swelling and settling by an amount too small to see, over and over, forever. So we are left with a problem. The Sumerians could not have heard this. The science does not allow it. The shaking is too low, too faint, smaller than the lower limit of the ear, by 10,000 times. By every rule we know, the men lying on that temple floor should have felt nothing. There is a way out of the problem, and I want to give it to you, because it is almost certainly part of the answer. They were not hearing the hum directly. They were feeling its effects. A steady shaking moving through solid rock does things. It can set up faint, steady patterns in a closed stone room. It can move the top of still water by an amount the eye can catch in the right light. A person lying still against rock, in total darkness, with nothing else competing for attention, becomes a very sensitive tool. Not sensitive enough for 2.9 millihertz, but sensitive enough, perhaps, for the things that pitch does to a room full of stone and water. That explanation works. It holds. The Sumerians built a kind of listening tool out of their own bodies and a few bowls of water, and they pointed it at the floor. The problem is what they picked up next. Because the modern study of the hum did not stop at proving it exists, it went on to ask what causes it. And the answer, the best answer, is the ocean. The planet's hum is driven in large part by the endless pounding of ocean waves against the seafloor and the shallow edges of the land, long, slow waves of pressure rolling across the deep and rocking the crust. The whole Earth rings softly because the seas never stop moving against it, which means the hum has a season. In winter, when the great storm systems stir the oceans hardest, the hum grows stronger. In the calmer months, it dies down. Modern records show it clearly. The planet's background tone rises and falls across the year, louder in the storm seasons, softer between them, a slow breathing rhythm tied to the weather of half the planet. Now go back to the tablet. The priests at Nippur recorded the same thing. They logged the months when the voice grew strong and the months when it thinned. They tied it to the calendar. They believed they could read the year by it, and the cycle they describe, a swelling in certain seasons and a fading in others, matches the behavior of a thing they had no way to understand. They were not just feeling the hum, they were tracking its seasons, 3,000 years before anyone could explain why it had any. Years after the Nippur tablet was first read this way, a second, smaller piece turned up in a different collection, broken and unfinished, but pointing at the same thing. It came from a different southern city and a different century, and it describes the same routine in nearly the same words. Listeners against the floor, bowls of still water, a low voice from below that strengthened and weakened with the turning of the year. Two records, separated by distance and time, written by people who in all likelihood never met, describing the same method aimed at the same sound. That is not how myths usually travel. Myths drift. They pick up gods and monsters and local details as they move from city to city. This did not drift. It stayed exact. The second piece uses the same careful, calm language as the first, the language of men writing down a real thing they expected to be there again tomorrow. When two separate scribes in two separate places record the same dry steps for measuring the same impossible signal, you are no longer looking at a fancy phrase that spread by retelling. You are looking at something people across the region were actually doing, because there was actually something there to measure. That is the point where the comfortable explanation starts to come apart. It seemed small at first, a nice coincidence about winter. It wasn't small, because if they were correctly recording the rhythm of the Earth's natural ringing, then the rest of what they wrote down has to be taken seriously too. And the rest of what they wrote down is where this stops being a story about an interesting echo and becomes a story about the night it ended. For a long stretch of the tablet, things are calm, the voice is steady, the seasons turn. The listeners do their work, generation after generation, and the record reads almost like a logbook, dry and calm. That calm runs for what the text suggests is 300 years of steady watching, handed down from one set of listeners to the next. That stretch of calm does not last. The final section of the tablet changes tone completely. The careful, even writing of the record gives way to something tighter. The scribe writes that the voice had begun to behave wrongly, not louder or softer with the season, the way it always had. Wrongly. It came at the wrong times. It pressed from the wrong direction. On some nights, the text says, it stopped for hours and then returned, which it had never done that anyone alive could remember. The listeners argued about what it meant. Older records were pulled and read aloud, and underneath the dry record, you can feel something the scribes would not write directly, which is that they were frightened. Then comes the line the whole tablet has been moving toward. In the rule of a king whose name the scribe barely finishes writing, on a night the text marks with special care, the voice under the mountains stopped. Not faded, not thinned with the season, stopped, completely. The bowls went still, the floor went quiet. The listeners lay against the stone through the whole of the night and felt nothing. And the next night nothing, and the night after that nothing. The thing that had been beneath the city since before the city was simply not there anymore. The tablet records what they did in the hours after. And this is the part that I genuinely cannot read to you, because it isn't there. The lines describing the response are damaged, not weathered. The surface in that exact section is broken away in a way that several people who have held the tablet call done on purpose, scraped or struck, as though someone wanted that part gone. What survives picks up again afterward, with the listeners recording, in flat, final words, that the voice did not return. The watch was kept for a time. Then the tablet ends. You would think someone in the centuries after would have written more, explained it, closed the loop. Nobody did. So what actually happened? The boring answer is the strongest one, and it is worth saying plainly. The voice did not come from a sleeping god. It came from groundwater. The Sumerians had a name for the great body of fresh water they believed sat beneath the land, the Abzu, the home of Enki, the deep that fed every spring and well. To them it was sacred and alive. To a water scientist it is an aquifer, and an aquifer is exactly the kind of thing that would carry and boost a faint shaking in the ground up into a stone room. Water under pressure, filling the rock beneath the temple, turning the whole base into something that rings. The priests weren't hearing the planet. They were hearing the planet through the water table. And the water table can drop. Around 2200 BCE, the area was hit by one of the worst droughts in all of human history. Climate scientists call it the 4.2 Kiloyear event. Across Mesopotamia and far beyond, the rain almost stopped. In the north, winter rain may have dropped by a third to a half for generations. Cities were left empty. The Akkadian Empire, the first empire the world had ever built, came apart in just a few decades, and many researchers link its fall straight to that drought. At a place called Tel Leilan, researchers found floors left in the middle of use, buried under a thick layer of wind-blown dust, the silence of a place people simply walked away from. A drought like that empties the underground water. It drops the water table. And if the voice under the mountain was the sound of underground water ringing beneath Nippur, then the explanation for the night it stopped is almost painfully simple. The water that carried the sound pulled back into the deep rock and did not come back. The tool went dry. The priests were not left by anything below. They were standing over a bowl that had quietly emptied, listening for a tone that no longer had any water left to ride. That is the answer. It is clean, it is solid, and it fits the dates almost perfectly. There is only one thing it does not explain. The Earth's hum never actually stops. We know this now for sure. It is everywhere, and it never stops. In 2017, researchers managed for the first time to record it directly from the floor of the deep ocean, far from any city or aquifer. And there it was, exactly as expected, the planet ringing its endless low note up through the dark water far below. Whatever happened at Nippur, the hum itself did not end. It could not have. It is still going on, beneath your feet, right now, at a pitch you will never feel. So the priests did not lose the voice. They lost their link to it. The water drew back, the room went deaf, and a thing that had quietly run beneath their whole world kept going without them, not caring, the way it had continued for billions of years before the first listener ever lay down on that floor. If the tablet had ended on the drought, this would be a neat story about clever people and a drying land. It does not end there. It ends on the warning. The scribe, or whoever wrote the final lines before the damage, did not write that the voice had dried up or drained away. He wrote that it had gone quiet. He chose that word, the way you would describe a person falling silent in a room, not a sound running out. And he wrote that when the voice goes quiet, it has not left. It has turned its attention up toward the surface, toward the people who had spent 300 years lying in the dark, pressing their ears to its ceiling, listening. That is almost certainly the part where the record stops being a record and becomes something older, fear, given a shape. A people watching the base of their world fall silent in the middle of a disaster they could not explain, reaching for the only way they had to explain it, which was that the silence meant something, that something below had heard them at last. This is where Zechariah, Sitchin, and the writers who came after him built a whole myth, reading the Sumerian deep as the home of the Anunnaki, beings beneath and beyond the world, and the silence of the tablet as proof of something waking. Serious experts reject that reading completely, and the case against it is strong. The texts say what they say. Adding spacecraft and sleeping gods is a choice the words do not require. But strip the myth away, and a smaller, stranger fact is still sitting there in the clay. A group of people, 4,000 years ago, correctly wrote down that a planet-wide shaking was real, and how it rose and fell with the seasons, a shaking science could not find until the end of the 20th century. They tracked it for 3 centuries. And then, during the worst drought their world had ever known, it stopped. and they wrote down that the silence felt like being watched. The hum is still here. We have heard it from the bottom of the ocean. We have measured its pitch and mapped its seasons, and we still argue about everything that causes it. The deep is not empty, and it is not quiet, and it has never once stopped making the sound the Sumerians said it made. A struck bell rings long after you stop touching it. The Sumerians believed the earth was a bell that had been struck once, at the beginning, and had never stopped ringing since. They were closer to right than anyone had any business being. The only thing they got wrong was the silence. The voice under the mountain never went quiet. The listeners did.